those cities will be competitive with Western living standards. So paradoxically, China is currently poor, but soon to be rich, because it's growing so fast. It's just a matter of using the compound interest formula. If you start with P dollars, that's P for principal, that grows at a rate of R% per year, and that's R rate. Then after Y years, your P dollars will have grown to A dollars, A for amount, where A equals P, and then in brackets, all to the power Y of 1 plus R over 100. For cities like Guangzhou, Shanghai, etc., with a growth rate of about 15%, then A will double every 5 years. 5 years. So it's fair to say that America's position is greatly superior to China's at the time of writing, but that its velocity is greatly inferior. The US is growing at about 3% a year. Every time I returned in the past to the US after visiting China, I felt that the Americans were asleep. But despite my own personal income, I have to deal with the general poverty all around me, the dirt in the streets, the brutalized, ignorant faces of the peasants streaming in from the countryside villages to seek their fortunes in the more prosperous cities. These poor creatures, poor financially, poor spiritually, poor educationally, stare vapidly into space, lost, crushed, bewildered by the city life they see all around them that is so alien to them. China still has about 600 million peasants living in villages with their oxen and rice paddies. I see them, the peasants and the paddies, in their millions as I look out from the train windows. China has 1 million villages and still has a long, long way to go before the whole country is rich. During my first summer full-time in China, I visited the northwest and saw people so poor they didn't even use money. They lived off their yaks and goats. Their faces were unwashed. They looked on us as Martians with our cars and cell phones and digital cameras. The government is pouring money into the area to build up the infrastructure, particularly roads and railways, to stimulate economic growth in that part of the country. Otherwise, the disparities of wealth between the prosperous East and impoverished West may become so great that the two will split. Most of the PLA, People's Liberation Army, soldiers are from the poorer West. What will happen when they get sufficiently angry at the inequalities? This leads me to the next major topic. Dictatorship and corruption. As almost everyone on the planet knows, China is ruled by a dictatorship, a one-party, supposedly Marxist-based state, which does not tolerate dissenters and throws them in jail, sometimes tortures them or even kills them. China is despised by the West for its lack of respect for the rights of the individual. So again, why am I in China? Ad-libbing. The essentials, what's so horrible about China, even today in 2017, it's a brutal dictatorship. It has over 1,000 Laogai. Laogai is a slave labor camp, concentration camp for political prisoners, over 1,000 of them, with 3 to 5 million political prisoners, according to Harry Wu, founder of the Laogai Museum in Washington, D.C. Mao Zedong, the first president of China, communist, killed over 80 million people during his reign. 45 million, the Great Famine, 58 to 62, that he caused. He put about 50 million through the Laogai, 27 million of them died. So we're up to about 70 million now. The Cultural Revolution, the anti-rightist campaigns, another 10 million or so. So a total of about 80 million that he killed, which makes him history's greatest tyrant. He's killed more people than anyone else, and yet his face is still on China's money. Just a minute. Just to make a point. So this man is history's greatest tyrant, and yet his face is on the country's money, the country in the world with the largest. So here's a 50 RMB, and that's Mao Zedong's face. Here's a 10 RMB, Mao Zedong's face. A 5 RMB, Mao Zedong's face. And a 1 RMB, Mao Zedong's face. When China removes the greatest tyrant's face from its money, then the world will stop calling China a political pygmy, a political shithole. Okay, where was I? Back to the book. China is despised by the West for its lack of respect for the rights of the individual. So again, why am I in China? In practice, I'm barely conscious of the presence of the CCP, Chinese Communist Party. If I were totally apolitical, then I could live quite a carefree life here. So far, I've had no run-in at all with the government. I have no intention to be a martyr, so very probably this critical part of this section on China will simply be censored before publication in China, as were any negative comments about Mao Zedong in my previous book when it was published in China. If Chinese readers want to read the uncensored version, assuming the American publish don't censor the negative comments I made about the US in this book, they will have to read the English version. Living now, since I've now made after 11 or 12 years living in China, I've made the decision to go back to the West. My sister has made me a very generous offer of buying an apartment and allowing me to live in it rent-free, so I may take up her offer. Well, I almost certainly will. So I will leave China in a year or so. So I don't care what I say about China anymore. Now I just come out with the negative truth. China is a political shithole. One of the preconditions that will need to be satisfied before large numbers of Westerners come to China is that the country becomes a democracy. Here. Otherwise, the talented, politically conscious Westerners will simply refuse to come, feeling too ashamed of the political backwardness of the country to want to have anything to do with it. There are some 120 plus democracies now in the world. I think now it's about 130. Of a total of about 200 countries, China is in the bottom third, hardly something to be proud of. To get some idea of the level of dictatorial practice in China, one can consult the rankings provided by, here's the link, www.worldaudit, that's one word, audit.org/democracy.htm, which attempts to compare the levels of democratic development in all the countries of the world. Of 210 countries, it gives China as democracy rank of 126, a press freedom rank of 138, and a corruption rank of 57, where a score of 1 was the most democratic, Finland, and 210 was the worst. What then is the prospect of China becoming a democracy in the coming years? I ask this question all the time with my Chinese colleagues who feel relaxed enough with me to tell me what they truly think. A lot of them is saying 5 to 10 years, or 10 to 20 years. Some say 50 years. I doubt very much it will be as long as 50 years. My own calculation that it will be in the 10 to 15 year range. See figure 1 in chapter 3. China already has some degree of democracy in the villages. Local leaders are elected by the villagers themselves, so at least half of the Chinese live in a form of democracy, at least at the village level, but not at the town and city level. The mayors of cities are appointed by the CCP, undemocratically, not by the people, and not with rival parties competing for people's votes. But in Guangzhou, academics are now pushing for democratic reforms in that city. Perhaps the democratic snowball has already started rolling? It was also in Guangzhou that Sun Yat-sen was based, who founded the Chinese People's Party, Kuomintang, and overthrew the Qing dynasty in 1911. How do I think democracy will come to China? The big question is whether it will come from inside the CCP or from outside it. I hope the reforms will come from inside, because if not, then there may be violence, perhaps even war. Just before the Tiananmen Square massacre, when Deng Xiaoping, decided to kill the students demonstrating for democracy, surveys showed that about 60+% of Beijing residents wanted to live in a democracy. Similar or higher figures would probably be true in most eastern cities at the time of writing. So why do we not see massive demonstrations of people power in China's city streets the way we have seen in so many other countries that have already made the transition from dictatorship to democracy? Well, fear. The Chinese are afraid because the CCP leadership is terrified, it says, of chaos. There have been terrible incidents in Chinese history when uprisings caused tens of millions of deaths. In the middle of the 19th century, about the same time as the US Civil War, the so-called Taiping Rebellion killed about 20 million people, the greatest war in history up to that time. Individual protesters or writers are often imprisoned. The CCP claims that if democracy were to come to China, there would be chaos and huge numbers of people would be killed. They therefore clamp down heavily on dissenters, making the Chinese afraid of their own unelected government. The CCP leadership only had to look at what happened in Russia under Gorbachev when he loosened up politically with his perestroika and glasnost programs. Or even worse, what happened to some of the Eastern European dictators, some of whom were killed by their peoples. For example, Ceausescu, forgetting his name, Ceausescu in Romania. There are still many democracy protesters in China's gulags, or laogai as they are called. The world should know more about China's laogai and the word itself. Is the fear on the part of the CCP leadership that chaos would result if attempts were made to install democracy in China a legitimate concern? Or is it more the case that the corruption levels among CCP local government and higher level officials who have profited mightily from their positions of power to make commercial deals with local businessmen are such that if democracy were to come, bringing with it the rule of law, the courts, freedom of the press, muckraking journalists and many more lawyers, that these CCP officials are dead scared that they would lose their power and privileges by being exposed? If it were the latter, it would then be understandable that they would want to crack down on democracy dissenters to safeguard their corrupt privileges, would it not? I just don't know how deep and how high up the corruption goes, if it is so widespread that the CCP cannot be reformed, as I suggest in my plan below. Then there will be no choice other than pushing it aside with people power, as has happened in many other countries. Actually, as is mentioned several times in this book, experience shows that in about 3/4 of cases in which a dictatorial regime is replaced by a democratic one, the overthrowing Democratic Party is in fact a breakaway faction of the former dictatorial party. Such transitions are usually smoother and less revolutionary. People power type revolutions, for example in the Philippines, which push the dictatorial leaders out of power, are more prone to violence because they are more revolutionary. For me, it's a toss-up between the two routes. That is, whether it's more likely that the change to democracy will occur inside or outside the party. One thing for sure for me, and many others I have talked to, is that it is inevitable that China will become a democracy in time. See Figure 1 in Chapter 3. The country is growing so fast that there are already about 100 million middle-class educated Chinese. As that number grows, sooner or later, we will see people power take root and democracy will spring up spontaneously because the majority of the people will want it and will no longer tolerate not having it. That is what people power means. Look at Indonesia and the East European countries after Gorbachev. The internet is having a major effect on students and the richer portion of the Chinese population. The CCP has taken great efforts to censor it. There is talk that some 30,000 people are employed in China to censor the internet pages coming into the country. For example, I cannot get text files from the BBC World Service. That was 10 years ago. But I can listen to their spoken news broadcasts. The reason being that so few Chinese can understand spoken English that even if they had the internet, 160 million people in China do already. I think that figure now is over 600 million have the internet. 160 million people in China do already. Yeah, so this is written about 10 years ago, and the number is growing rapidly. Then they couldn't understand. The foreigners in China then can listen to the spoken broadcasts, so don't complain as much. The censorship is subtle. One cannot accuse the CCP of being stupid, at least not with the small picture. But some things cannot be done subtly. For example, if I type in a keyword such as Lao Gai, China's extensive labour camp system for political prisoners, nothing comes up. But as all the students know, there are ways of getting around the censorship and getting access to anything. My students quickly told me of software that can circumvent the CCP censorship, thank God, so I can keep in touch with everything and read what I want. If millions of students can do the same, then the CCP is doomed. The next generation of Chinese citizens, the educated ones, will be a different breed. They will see the world so differently from Mao and his cronies. They will have been educated by a worldwide perspective from the internet. They will be ashamed of China's political backwardness and be motivated to get rid of it. Then there are the returnees, that is, Chinese students who studied in the West and have decided to return to China now that the country is really on the move. They want to be part of it, as do I. They have actually lived in the West, felt firsthand the advantages of having freedom of speech, political parties, respect for the individual, the rule of law, high living standards. They want all this for China too, and are just waiting in the wings for China to make the transition. It's all only a question of time. So, how will the transition occur? I'm hoping that within the CCP there is a plan, that is, a detailed step-by-step plan for a smooth transition to democracy. If the CC plays its cards right, it may not only arrange a smooth transition, but stay in power as well, because the CCP does have one overwhelming advantage that any fledgling party would not have, and that is experience in governing the country. If such a plan does not exist, then it should, because without it, the transition will have to come from outside the CCP, and that may mean violence, perhaps even war. Thus, if the CCP has any concern for the well-being of the Chinese people, it should make the transition from within. But how? If a plan does not exist, then here is the skeleton of one. I have not studied this question in detail because it's not my specialty. There are academics around the world in political science departments of universities whose specialty is transitology, that is, the study of the transition from dictatorial to democratic governments. They have elaborate plans for such transitions in various circumstances. With 120 plus democracies in the world now about 130, there have been plenty of examples to examine and theorize about. Doubtless, there are such plans for China. Here's my plan. Call it the Garis plan. How the CCP can stay in power after the transition to democracy. 1. Study the internet to find transitological plans for China. 2. Pick the most appropriate, most realistic one. 3. Implement it. If no such plan exists, hard to imagine, then 1. Set a date for national elections, for example, 3 years in the future. 2. Allow rival political parties to be formed 1 year into the future and give them media time to make their case. 3. Allow freedom of the press and the internet 1 year in the future. 4. During the first year, systematically and dramatically purge and punish the corruptors from the CCP. 5. During the first year, advertise these purges to give the public the idea that the CCP is reforming itself vigorously to stay in power. 6. Relabel the CCP to CSDP, Chinese Social Democratic Party, 1 year in the future. 7. Make a strong case to the public that the CSDP is the only party in the country with real experience of government. Quote, "Do you want your country run by amateurs?" End quote. 8. Bring in the rule of law, train more lawyers, make modern commercial laws, civil laws, etc. Modernize the courts. 9. By the end of the 3 years, the CSDP should be a modern Western-style political party. 10. Hold elections and bring China into the modern world. Is this plan naive? If it were to be implemented, what could go wrong with it? Would there be chaos as the CCP top bosses fear? Would the Chinese people go ape? Would they behave responsibly? China has never had much of a democratic tradition. There have been a few quasi-democratic elections in China in the 20th century, but their consequences were soon snuffed out. I suggest that the CCP arrange public chats, rather like Roosevelt used to do on the radio to the American public. Hu Jintao, the current Chinese leader, this is written 10 years ago, or his successor could explain on TV talks to the public that Chinese democracy is coming, starting on a given date, when the elections will be held, that protesters may protest, but not destroy the country. If things get out of hand, the military will be called in. Trade unions will be allowed, with the same warning. Newspapers will stop being censored, but again, the journalists should be pressured not to whip up a frenzy, so that the transition can be smooth. Too risky? Too dangerous? I may live to see the transition, now having a Chinese wife and feeling committed to stay in China for many years. Ad-libbing now. Well, I did. 11 years so far, and probably I'll stay two more years and then I will leave. I hope the transition, when it comes, will be peaceful and planned. I'm predicting it will occur in about 10 to 15 years from the time of writing. See Figure 1 in Chapter 3. So if I wrote this 10 years ago, predicting democracy in China within 5 years, probably not. Maybe 10. Back to the book. The individual disrespected. One of the first things that shocked me about the Chinese was their lack of respect for the rights of the individual. China is Asian. Family comes first, not the individual. China has never had a democracy for very long. There's no tradition that respects the rights of the individual. There's very little in the way of the rule of law in China, so people cannot readily sued for abusing others. It will take many years of democracy in China and the rule of law to socially engineer the Chinese people to feel that individuals have rights. One of the greatest offences in this regard, in my view, is the fact that the CCP still holds up Mao Zedong as a hero, a leader, a god in some respects. But in reality, the guy was a tyrant who, according to a recent biography written by a Chinese-British woman, Zhong Chang, killed 70 million people in peacetime. That's more than Stalin or Hitler, making him the greatest criminal in history, if what she says is true. Judging by the number of top people she interviewed in many countries who knew Mao, she is probably correct. The obvious question then arises, how can any well-informed Chinese person have pride in his own country when the very symbol of the leadership of the party governing the country is history's greatest criminal, that is Mao Zedong, killer of 70 million? I have a book by his private doctor who said Mao had a harem and venereal disease that he really readily transmitted to his 20-year-old women, claiming that he washed himself in them. He also said that Mao rarely took a bath or cleaned his teeth. Mao caused thousands of his own soldiers to be killed just to further his own ambitions, or far worse, in the time of the Great Leap Forward, 1958, he had so many peasants work on the village blast furnaces, gathering already made steel implements to melt them down to make low-grade unusable steel. To do what? Make steel implements? That the harvests were too small, resulting in the greatest famine in Chinese history, in which about 30 million Chinese peasants died. 30 million! According to an American professor, Dakota, who got access to the recent openings of the province's archives, he estimates that the number of people who starved to death in the Great Famine caused by Mao Zedong between 58 and 62 was about 45 million. Mao then lost prestige and power within the CCP for this. To get back his power, he launched the Cultural Revolution by giving free train rides to millions of high school student Red Guards to rampage through the countryside to depose, torture and kill people who had different beliefs from him. Several hundred million people had their lives made miserable for a decade. Many committed suicide. The universities were shut down for a decade. My own Chinese wife was a Red Guard and did not get the education her intelligence merits as a result. The national level of production was lower when Mao died, roughly 30 years after governing the country, than when he started. He knew nothing of economics. Fortunately for the country, one of his fellow leaders he had purged several times was the little but smart guy, Deng Xiaoping, who was forced to work as a labourer for some years. When Mao died, he grabbed power, had Mao's wife and cronies arrested, and steered China into market capitalism. At the time of writing, China has had nearly 30 years of Deng-ism, and it has been spectacularly successful economically. Politically, however, China is still third world. Since Deng and subsequent CCP leaders owe their power to Mao, the founder of the CCP government, they use his image to help themselves stay in power. If the Chinese people knew the truth about Mao, the way Western countries do, their government would be utterly discredited and thrown out. Hence, as a part of the decorruption process in the above Garis plan for Chinese democratization, the image of Mao will need to be purged from the CCP, similar to the way in which Khrushchev publicly discredited Stalin. The CCP will need to publicly discredit Mao and distance itself from him. The party will have to take down all Mao statues, including the huge portrait of him facing Tiananmen Square. No modern, self-respecting state can have as its symbol the image of the world's greatest mass murderer. All the Chinese banknotes which currently feature Mao's face will have to be redesigned. I suggest Mao's face be replaced by Sun Yat-sen's, who was the leader of the party which overthrew the old Qing dynasty in 1911. Sun Yat-sen wanted China to be modern, rich and free. That is, he was a Democrat. China cannot become the world's leading nation, that is, the most respected nation in the world, the way the US is today, as long as it honours Mao. For China to become number one, it must totally dissociate itself from Maoism and get rid of the CCP, or at least reform it so thoroughly that it becomes the CSDP, a democratic party. I suspect all this will happen in the next 10 to 15 years. I may be wrong, but we shall see. A culture of liars. One of the most maddening characteristics of the Chinese from the Western viewpoint is that they are not to be trusted. That is, in the sense that they will lie to you far more readily than is normal in Western countries. One's impression is that the Chinese give a lower priority to the value of truth than do Westerners. They live in a culture of constant lying, so they learn not to take statements too literally. In a culture which does not have the rule of law, where the idea of a contract is not a binding, sacrosanct legal document, when breaking a contract is for them not a big deal. I have been the victim of this to some extent. I hope that once the rule of law has been well established in China, where contracts are enforced, as they are in most countries in the world, then when one says something to another person, that the probability of it being true in China will go up. Chinese on the whole don't care much for individuals outside their own circle. If they have no guanxi, pronounced guanxi, that is relations with someone, then the probability is higher that that person will be treated badly than would be the case in a similar situation in the West, because Westerners have been brought up to consider the rights of other individuals, even strangers, as people with rights. This kind of thinking is foreign in China and is one of the aspects of daily life in China that really gets me down. In practice, I find I can only tolerate a certain small dose of Chineseness per day. I'm fine when I'm lecturing, because for the moment it's in English. I'm also fine when I'm at home with my 10,000 books, but when I'm dealing with Chinese bureaucracy, with Chinese in the high street, then out come traditional Chinese values and the cultural clashes come to the surface. Sloths. Another maddening daily characteristic of many Chinese is their intellectual or organizational slothfulness. It's worst with government services. In the past, when the whole economy was government planned and controlled, that is before Deng's time, when people got a government job, it was a job for life. That is what the Chinese call an iron, I-R-O-N, an iron rice bowl. That is one that would not break. That is a lifelong meal ticket, a safe, secure job for life, in which you are paid irrespective of the quality of the job you do. In other words, you become unaccountable. Under such circumstances, and with a general lack of respect for the individual in Chinese culture, many such government employees give appallingly lazy service. I label them bujadaoers, pronounced bujadao, that is, I don't know-ers. Because typically what they say to you when you ask them something or to do something for you is bujadao, I don't know. Basically their attitude is that they don't give a damn about you or your needs. They only want to collect their paycheck with minimum effort. As you get closer to the coastal cities, and especially towards the southeast, the general service level increases a lot. People seem more on the ball and less mentally lazy in general. My Chinese wife lived in Guangzhou, the southeast coastal town near to Hong Kong, which is China's richest city, before she moved to live with me, and she can't stand the bougidawas of the city we now live in, which was Wuhan. I've had 2 Chinese wives. I suppose I take it for granted that the level of service and efficiency of the Western countries may be a result